Hey y'all, welcome back. This is part two of the video on the 1960s. The first one, I got some internet issues and I just didn't want to redo the whole thing. So we're going to pick up here. We're talking about President Johnson's Great Society and the things that were implemented in that Great Society program: Medicare, Medicaid, a lot of programs to fight poverty, federal aid for education, ending the quota system on immigrants that had been established in the 1920s. So immigration was opened up for more people around the world. It wasn't based on racial prejudices like it was in the 1920s. So this led to a lot more immigration. Also, the Great Society program instituted a lot of environmental regulations. One of the most important, probably the most important legislation passed during the Johnson years, there's two: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I mentioned in the first video, and then the second is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And both of those, I can't even make a speculation on which one I think was more important. They're both extremely important pieces of legislation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was sort of sparked by the Selma. So here's another extra credit opportunity. There's a great movie called Selma. If you write one page about what you learned, I'll give you some extra credit points on a quiz. So that march from Selma to Montgomery created a lot of knowledge of the issues with voting in the South. So if y'all can recall, if you took History 2010, after the Civil War ended, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to African American men. In the South, that legislation ended up being fairly meaningless because the KKK and other racial terrorist groups, their main goal was to prevent African Americans from voting, and they used lynching and other terrorist attacks to carry out that goal. So very few African Americans voted, and it wasn't just because of threats of violence. Also, the literacy tests were designed to be failed by they were designed to fail African Americans. So no matter how well an African American person could read, they probably wouldn't pass the literacy test. So there were just all kinds of obstacles to voting. By throughout the 20th century, very few Southern Blacks could vote. So even when women's suffrage happened in 1920, that really didn't apply to Black women in the South because of all these tactics to keep Blacks from voting. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was put in place to overcome those obstacles to voting. It prohibited literacy tests and poll taxes for voting. And most importantly, it authorized federal oversight of voting if states failed to respect the 15th Amendment. So that pretty much applied to every state in the South. The Voting Rights Act made it to where there would be federal oversight. There would be people from the federal government watching voting to make sure that it was equitable and available to all adults. So the Voting Rights Act is seen as sort of the peak of civil rights movement legislation. So we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation and discrimination in all public places, and then this Voting Rights Act. So for many people, they felt the things that they had been fighting for had been accomplished, at least on paper. So this is when we began to see a shift in the civil rights movement. The early 60s and the 1950s, the movement was all about legislation, about getting the Supreme Court to rule in opposition to segregation. It was about getting Congress to pass anti-discrimination bills and voting rights bills. And that had happened by 1965. But quickly, people realized that those acts and laws were not going to change everything. They weren't going to solve the problems of racism. So this is when there's a shift in the movement, and a lot of civil rights organizers, protesters began thinking, well, we've accomplished all of our legal and political goals. Now we need to work on cultural and economic issues. So this is where even people like Martin Luther King began to think more about like the economics of racism, things like job discrimination, things like schools, like some schools not being as good as others, about housing discrimination, police discrimination and police brutality, and also cultural racism. They begin to look at things like the media, television shows. Um, they begin to think maybe we need African American history included in our history classes that it didn't used to be. So a lot of protesters began to organize to get like African American History Month and African American history classes, because African American history was not included in mainstream American history. So just kind of know that by the mid 60s, the goals start to change a little bit. They realize you can't fix everything with laws. In the mid 60s is also kind of the beginning of like the hippie movement. I usually talk about music a lot in class, but time is so limited on these Zoom videos. Just know that like by the mid 60s, a lot of music was reflecting countercultural ideas. People like Bob Dylan, Mamas and Papas. A lot of music began to shift from New York City to the West Coast to California. And they began to sort of popularize like the hippie movement, the counterculture movement, which was really a rejection of the 1950s. It was a rejection of sort of this Cold War mentality, conformism, consumerism, capitalism, suburban culture. So the 1960s sort of counterculture was kind of just a direct backlash against kind of the stale, conformist, fit in the box culture of the 1950s. There were several pretty significant music festivals. Monterey Pop Festival in California in 1967. And then, of course, everyone knows about Woodstock in 1969 in New York. Both of those events were huge, widely publicized events that made more people aware of sort of this growing counterculture movement. We're going to look at the Vietnam War next week, and we'll put all that together. A lot of this counterculture was in opposition to the Vietnam War. In the mid 60s, we also see the beginning of the Black Power movement. So first, let's talk about the Black Panthers. They were formed in 1966. And what they were really trying to do is sort of take control of the civil rights movement. A lot of young white people had been very involved in the civil rights movement and had been part of like a lot of great change. They had been very active in supporting the movement, and that was really beneficial because it brought more awareness to happening, and it also made it's not. I would have liked to think that law enforcement officials wanted to protect civil rights protesters, even if there weren't white ones included, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Having white members there did create more protection for the civil rights protesters. But by the mid 1960s, a lot of African American civil rights protesters began to think maybe they wanted to be more at the head of it. So the Black Panthers were one of these groups, and they were a legitimate political party. And their goals were a little bit more aggressive than some of the earlier leaders of the movement. They never advocated violence, but they did advocate armed self-defense. So they carried guns very openly, which was legal in California where they were formed. And part of what they were doing was protecting, it was self-defense. So the Black Panther Party, the proper name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. So they did advocate armed self-defense. And one of their goals was to sort of protect city residents against police brutality. So whenever they saw like a member of the community being questioned by police officers, they would just sort of stand there and watch as a sort of a protecting group. They also opened up a lot of free breakfast like counters for kids to get like free breakfast before school. So they were very much like working with the community in inner cities. But the media just saw um, their black leather jackets and their guns and just sort of assumed that they were militant and dangerous and violent. That was a pretty unfortunate assessment because a lot of what they were doing was just trying to uplift their community and protect their community. They became part of the Black Power movement, which was another sort of change from the early civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s to the Black Power movement of the mid 60s up until the mid 70s. It's a big change. So the Black Power movement, they were more focused on cultural changes rather than getting laws passed. They didn't have a whole lot of faith in politics or in the political system. So instead, they really worked to change American culture from a cultural standpoint. So they began to come up with phrases such as "Black is beautiful," and this was a real powerful statement. And it was in response to hundreds of years of American culture sort of saying the opposite. So they wanted to sort of turn cultural aesthetics around. They began to celebrate afros. If you see like TV footage from the late 60s and the 70s, you see a lot of African Americans with big afros. And that was another rejection of mainstream aesthetic ideas. So they were sort of celebrating their African ethnicity and celebrating their African roots as far as celebrating things that were distinctly African American. Instead of sort of being embarrassed about those things, they were, celebrating them as a positive, as a good thing. So it was all about this idea of power. So Black Power. I think of songs like James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, Respect by Otis Redding, and then Aretha Franklin. They're all kind of along the same lines of saying, I'm proud of who I am. I'm no longer accepting that mainstream society sees me as inferior or less beautiful or less important. I'm actually saying that I am proud of who I am. So it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about legal changes, but it was a pretty powerful cultural statement. It had a lot of impact. So you begin to see like more African American representation in TV shows, in movies. So that's kind of what they were going for, is to change the mindset from one of this negativity to something that's positive, to celebrating who they are. So it reminds me a lot of the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s. The Black Power movement had a lot of impact on other groups of people. In the late 60s, you began to hear things like Native American power, gay power, Chicano power. So this movement really influenced other groups of people to start to sort of take pride in who they are and want to learn more about their ethnic heritage. The gay power movement, the gay rights movement, was kind of came to it had a very definitive beginning as far as a successful campaign. There had been there were a lot of organizations, several organizations in the 1950s, and even some prior that were about equality for gay people, but they were pretty underground, mostly because during the 1950s, you could be considered a national security threat if you were openly gay. It wasn't something people talked about. You kept it very hidden. So one of the goals of the gay rights movement was to change that. They wanted people to just sort of come out and say, I'm gay, and say, I'm proud of that. I'm not hiding it. So coming out of the closet was one of their main goals. And again, it wasn't about legal changes. It was about sort of this cultural shift where being gay is no longer seen as a psychiatric disorder or something that makes you like a deviant. Their goal was to make it something that's a normal part of society, for people to be proud of that. So one of the things that they accomplished was the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. That happened in the early 70s when they removed it. And it was in the early 50s when they listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. So it was also in the late 60s, in the couple of court cases and throughout the 1960s, that took away laws making it illegal to be gay. Particularly in Texas, there were anti-sodomy laws. If you were having sexual relations with someone of the same gender, you could be arrested. That was against the law. So these things started to change in the late 60s. We see the Native American movement. They began to sort of do the same thing as the Black Power movement, saying, you know, I'm proud of my cultural heritage and I want to celebrate that. And I want to learn more about it. So they began to teach Native American history. They began to have like Native American history events and just sort of make people more aware, and trying to build some sort of cultural pride rather than something that people were like felt inferior about. And even in the early 1970s, we see a disability rights movement where disabled people began to want more inclusion in media, to be represented in TV shows and movies, and for disabilities to not be looked at as a marker of inferiority. So that's when we began to have like handicapped parking spaces and accessible entrances. Like if you know you go to a building, they have to have a ramp for people in wheelchairs to get up. That was never those things were never required prior to the disability rights movement. So these different movements of the late 1960s had a huge impact, and really it all started with the civil rights movement. Women's rights movement was also extremely important, and it was very similar to the Black Power movement in the sense that they were trying to change the culture. Women began to speak out about having limited options. They wanted to have the option of a career and a family, or one or the other, just to have the option. They wanted to change culture in the sense that maybe women can be viewed more by their intellectual, emotional attributes rather than just physical attributes. So the sort of the women's pride movement, or the women's lib movement, really focused on like changing fashion magazines, beauty pageants. They would have these protests where they had freedom cans, like trash cans that were called freedom cans, and they encouraged women to throw away items that represented female oppression, like high heels, bras. This is where we get the term bra burner. Fashion magazines, like diet stuff, like they were again, it was sort of like change the culture, change your personal outlook. They did have a big part in changing legislation as well, but most of the goals were about changing you personally. One of the pieces of legislation that the women's rights movement tried and tried again to pass was an Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment had been on the books for decades and it had not passed. And basically what it meant was that all laws should be the same for men and women. There should be no legal distinction on gender. And so in the 1960s and 70s, again, women were trying to get this law passed, but it never passed. And it was partly because if there's no legal differentiation for gender, then many people were worried that that would mean women would get drafted to go to war, just like men. But also a lot of women just didn't agree with an Equal Rights Amendment because they felt like maybe women are inherently different and maybe we do need different laws or different protections. They didn't want it to be the same across the board. So in general, all these movements of the late 60s really focused on individual changes, changing how you think, how you dress. For men, a lot of men in opposition to the Vietnam War began to grow their hair long. A lot of white men. began to grow their hair long and began to grow beards. That was a clear opposition to the Vietnam War, because in the military, you know, you're clean cut, you're clean shaven, short hair. So it was their way of sort of expressing opposition to the military and to the war. And as I mentioned, with African American men, the afro represented that. So all these changes were focused on personal changes. Cultural and personal in the late 60s, whereas the early 60s was more about legislation, court cases, laws. So I'm just going to take a quick, okay. Towards the end of the 1960s, a lot of, I'm going to get into this in the next video, but when y'all read the chapter, pay attention to the assassinations in 1968, and you'll read more about it next week. But this is also Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X a little bit earlier. A lot of people began to lose faith in the political system. They began to lose faith in America. A lot of the leaders who were standing up for people were assassinated in the late 1960s. So you can imagine what kind of impact that might have on, you know, a generation of people. All right, well, thanks guys for listening. Have a good day.